You are completely out of your mind if you think you belong in this family.
The sickening crunch of dried mud hitting imported Italian glass echoed through the penthouse boardroom, silencing the room faster than a gunshot. Ava Montgomery sat completely frozen, her perfect posture rigidly maintained as she stared at the scarred, manure-stained cowboy boots resting casually on the center of the $100,000 conference table. "Get your boots off the table, Wyatt, or I will have security remove your legs with them." Richard Cross hissed the billionaire's face a mask of barely contained aristocratic rage. Wyatt didn't flinch, merely tilting his weathered Stetson back with a calloused thumb to reveal a pair of piercing, predatory green eyes that swept the room with absolute disdain. "You called the dog inside, old man," Wyatt drawled, his voice a rough gravel that scraped against the sterile silence of the room. "Don't act surprised when he tracks in a little dirt." He shifted his gaze, bypassing the army of panicked corporate lawyers, and locked onto Ava with a look so sharp it felt like a physical blade sliding between her ribs. She was wearing a flawless Chanel suit, an armor of pearls and silk, but under the weight of his stare, she felt entirely naked. This was the illegitimate son. This was the feral animal she had just been contracted to marry. The suffocating reality of her situation tightened around her throat like a silk noose. Ava's family, the historically untouchable Montgomerys of Manhattan, were secretly drowning in a sea of toxic debt, and Richard Cross had offered the only viable lifeline. 3 months. She had exactly 90 days to tame this rugged frontier bastard, polish his rough edges, and present him to Wall Street as the legitimate heir to the Cross Empire, in exchange for a colossal capital injection into her father's failing accounts. It was a cold, calculated transaction, a high-stakes corporate acquisition where her future was the primary currency. She kept her chin lifted, refusing to let the wild-eyed man across the table see the frantic, terrified beating of her heart. "Your theatrics are unnecessary, Mr. Cross," Ava stated, her voice as cool and smooth as a frozen lake, effectively cutting through the heavy, toxic tension. "We are here to finalize a legal and social transition, not to witness a tantrum from a man who seems confused by the basic concept of indoor plumbing." A low, dark chuckle rumbled deep in Wyatt's chest, a sound completely devoid of humor and filled with a dangerous edge. He finally swung his heavy boots off the glass with a loud thud, leaning forward until the faint scent of worn leather, winter wind, and impending violence washed over her. "A transition, sweetheart," he mocked, his eyes narrowing as he clinically analyzed the pristine perfection of her hair and makeup. "You look like a porcelain doll someone bought off a top shelf, programmed to spit out corporate buzzwords on command." He didn't raise his voice, but the quiet menace vibrating in his tone made the high-powered attorneys in the room physically recoil in their expensive chairs. "I didn't ask to be dragged out of Montana to play dress-up in your concrete jungle." Richard slammed his open hand on the table, desperate to regain control of the crumbling narrative. "You are here because you share my blood, Wyatt, and because I am offering you the keys to a global empire." Richard snapped his eyes, darting nervously toward a thick stack of unread legal binders resting near Wyatt's elbow. "But you will learn respect, and Ava is here to ensure you don't embarrass this family." Ava noticed the strange, almost feverish urgency in Richard's demeanor, a subtle detail that immediately set off alarm bells in her highly trained legal mind. The billionaire was normally a man who savored the slow, agonizing burn of a negotiation, yet today he was practically vibrating with a frantic need to close the deal. He pushed a silver Mont Blanc pen across the glass, tapping a manicured finger against the signature line of a dense, incredibly complex power of attorney document. Sign the operational transfer, Wyatt, so we can move past this unfortunate introduction and begin your onboarding, Richard commanded, his tone brokering no argument and pushing for an immediate resolution. Ava's sharp instincts caught the glaring discrepancy instantly. It was highly irregular, almost suicidal, to grant a completely unvetted, uneducated heir immediate operational signing authority without a grueling probationary period. But her family's bankruptcy was a ticking time bomb, and her father's instructions were crystal clear. Secure the engagement, stabilize the heir, and ask absolutely no questions. She swallowed her professional protests, forcing herself to focus entirely on the feral man who was staring at the pen as if it were a venomous snake. He needs to understand the terms of his residency first, Richard. Ava interjected smoothly, seamlessly slipping into her role as the handler, to buy them a fraction of a second. She stood up, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from her tailored skirt, and walked around the massive table until she was standing just inches from Wyatt. He didn't back away. Instead, he squared his broad shoulders, a silent, overwhelming challenge radiating from his imposing physical frame. You will live in the corporate penthouse under my strict supervision, she instructed, meeting his hostile, burning glare with an icy, unwavering stare of her own. You will attend the gala next month as my fiancé. You will learn how to speak to the board without threatening physical violence, and you will do exactly as I say until this contract is fulfilled. She fully expected him to shout to overturn the table, or to storm out of the room in a blaze of frontier fury. She was prepared for his rage, but she was entirely unprepared for what he actually did. Wyatt leaned in, closing the microscopic distance between them, stripping away the last ounce of professional distance and oxygen in the room. And what do you get out of babysitting the bastard porcelain? He whispered, his voice a lethal caress that sent an involuntary, humiliating shiver cascading down her spine. Because I'm looking in your eyes right now, and I don't see a woman who gives a damn about me, my father, or this glittering company. His gaze dropped slowly to her mouth, lingering there for a heated second, then back up to her eyes, peeling back the layers of her carefully constructed composure with terrifying ease. I see a hostage. The sheer, brutal accuracy of his assessment hit Ava like a physical blow to the chest, stealing the breath from her lungs. For 27 years, no one in her elite, superficial circle had ever looked past her designer labels and perfect pedigree. This uneducated cowboy had just read the darkest truth of her soul in less than 5 minutes. She clenched her jaw tightly, suppressing the sudden, terrifying urge to tell him the truth. My motivations are none of your concern, she replied, her voice dangerously thin. Sign the paper, Wyatt. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the boardroom, broken only by the distant, muted sirens of the city far below them. Wyatt stared at Ava for a long, agonizing moment, his intense gaze weighing the quiet desperation hiding just behind her flawless facade. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and picked up the silver pen. He didn't turn a single page of the operational transfer, a reckless, blind move that made Ava's inner lawyer scream in absolute protest. I'll play your game, old man, Wyatt said to Richard without breaking eye contact with Ava, his large hand moving in swift, jagged strokes across the signature line. But don't think for a second that you've bought a tame dog. He tossed the expensive pen onto the table, where it clattered noisily against the glass, a sound of finality. "And you, sweetheart," he murmured, his attention solely on Ava as a dark, knowing smirk played on his rugged lips. "You better buckle up, because if we're going to be engaged, I'm going to rip off every single one of those fake, pretty masks you wear." Richard let out a loud, exaggerated breath of relief, snatching the signed documents with a frantic haste that once again triggered a flashing warning light deep in Ava's mind. "Excellent," the billionaire declared, his aristocratic mask firmly back in place, as he gestured eagerly for the lawyers to pack up their briefcases. "Ava, I leave him entirely in your capable hands. Make him presentable before the board meets next week." Within seconds, the room emptied with practiced corporate efficiency, the heavy mahogany doors clicking shut and severing them from the safety of the outside world. Ava was left entirely alone with the man who had just promised to dismantle her entire existence. Wyatt didn't move. He stood there, a massive, unyielding force of nature, looking completely out of place and yet utterly dominant in the glittering cage of Wall Street. He crossed his arms over his broad chest, his green eyes burning into hers with a raw, undeniable heat. The contract was signed. The trap was set. And as Ava looked at the wild, defiant air she was supposed to break, she realized with a cold, terrifying certainty that she was the one in danger of being torn apart. The drive from the Wall Street skyscraper to the Cross family's Manhattan penthouse was an agonizing exercise in silent warfare. Wyatt sat in the passenger seat of the armored black sedan, his massive frame appearing almost painfully constricted by the sleek, minimalist interior. He refused to look at the passing city, his gaze fixed on the reflection of the dashboard. Ava, driving, gripped the wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. The air inside the car felt dangerously thin, charged with the volatile combination of their mutual animosity and the looming weight of the contract. Every time she caught his reflection in the rearview mirror, she saw the same cynical, mocking amusement lurking in his green eyes. He was watching her, dissecting her, waiting for the slightest tremor of doubt to reveal her weakness. She kept her focus on the heavy New York traffic, her mind racing with the legal implications of the document he had just signed so recklessly. It was a blank check for disaster, and she was the one who would have to pick up the pieces when he inevitably imploded in front of the board. "You're sweating, Ava." Wyatt suddenly drawled, his voice a low, rough rumble that broke the suffocating silence. He shifted his broad shoulders, brushing against the leather door panel as he turned his head to look at her, his expression disturbingly calm. "You've checked the rearview mirror 7 times in the last 3 minutes. Are you expecting an assassin, or are you just terrified of being alone in a car with me?" Ava didn't blink, her gaze remaining fixed on the road ahead as she navigated the aggressive lane changes with practiced, icy precision. "I'm assessing the environment, Mr. Cross. It's a habit you'd do well to acquire if you have any intention of surviving the next 90 days. In this city, people don't hunt with knives in dark alleys. They hunt with signatures and leverage in rooms exactly like the one you just walked out of." She felt his stare intensifying a physical pressure on her profile that forced her to maintain her composure through sheer force of will. "And don't mistake my professional caution for fear. You are a project I am being paid to manage, nothing more, nothing less." Wyatt laughed, a short, dark sound that vibrated through the small space. "Paid to manage, that's a good one." He leaned back, his boots scuffing the expensive floor mat as he looked out the window at the towering skyscrapers. You talk about leverage like it's oxygen, Ava, but what happens when the very people you think you're working for are the ones holding the knife to your back? You Montgomerys are so desperate for a lifeline that you're willing to tie a noose around your own necks to get it. He didn't look at her, but his words landed with the precision of a surgeon. The truth in his statement was a cold, sharp blade. She knew the Montgomery family fortune was a facade, a crumbling mansion held together by prestige and lies. But hearing it spoken so casually by this untamed stranger made the reality feel exponentially more dangerous. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she snapped, her voice trembling slightly before she regained control. "Stick to the plan, Wyatt. Try not to embarrass me, and try to keep your opinions about my family to yourself." The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and cold polished marble that made Ava feel like she had entered a museum rather than a home. Wyatt stood in the middle of the cavernous, double-height living room, his presence appearing even more jarring against the minimalist, expensive decor than it had in the boardroom. He seemed to shrink the room, his rugged, raw energy clashing violently with the sleek, white sofas and the abstract, multi-million-dollar art pieces that lined the walls. "So this is where you live," he muttered, his voice echoing slightly as he wandered toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked down at the sprawling, glittering expanse of Manhattan far below, his expression unreadable. A birdcage in the sky. "How do you keep from suffocating up here, Ava?" "There's not a single thing in this room that looks like it has a heartbeat." Ava walked toward him, feeling the familiar hollow ache of the home she had lived in for years but never truly inhabited. "It's a place to sleep, Wyatt, not a lifestyle statement. And if you find it so suffocating, I suggest you get used to it. This is your reality for the next 3 months." He turned to face her, the movement sharp and deliberate. The playfulness had vanished, replaced by an intense, analytical focus that made her skin crawl. "My reality," he repeated, his eyes scanning her face as if searching for a hidden truth. "I spent my life in the real world, Ava. Dirt, animals, weather. Real hard, bleeding reality. You call this reality? This is a curated, air-conditioned delusion." He took a step toward her, his proximity an overwhelming force that compelled her to hold her ground despite her desire to flee. "And the funniest part is, you know it. You're playing the part of the perfect Montgomery princess because you're terrified that if you stop, the whole illusion will fall down and reveal that you have absolutely nothing left." He didn't wait for a response, simply walking past her toward the guest wing, his heavy boots sounding like thunder on the silent, pristine floor. "Tomorrow I start learning how to be the perfect lying heir," he called out over his shoulder, his tone dripping with self-deprecating irony. "Try to get some sleep, Ava. You're going to need your strength to polish this rock." Ava stood alone in the vast, silent living room, her hands shaking as she finally allowed her professional mask to crumble. The weight of his words was a suffocating, crushing pressure. Every single one of them was true. She had sacrificed every scrap of her personality, her dreams, and her genuine emotions to serve the dying legacy of a family that saw her as nothing more than an asset. Wyatt was the mirror she had spent her life trying to avoid, a man who saw her exactly as she was, a hostage to her own choices. She sat on the edge of the sofa, the cold leather chilling her skin through her suit, and closed her eyes. She needed to focus. She needed to find a way to handle him, to push him into the shape the board demanded, or they would both be destroyed. She reached for her tablet, pulling up the extensive, meticulously prepared training schedule she had spent weeks crafting. It was a precise, logical plan for his social rehabilitation. It was the only way. It had to be. The next morning, the onboarding began with an intensity that would have broken a less determined man. Ava had arranged for a team of tailors, grooming specialists, and social etiquette coaches to arrive at the penthouse by 7 o'clock. Wyatt, however, met them at the door, wearing nothing but a pair of faded denim jeans, his hair a wild, messy tangle, and a look of profound, irritated disbelief on his face. "Are you kidding me?" he asked, looking past Ava at the small army of professionals waiting in the hallway. "I'm here to learn how to sign board minutes, not to become a wax figure for your amusement." Ava didn't back down, her expression a mask of cool administrative efficiency. "You are here to represent the Cross name, and the Cross name requires a certain standard of presentation. These are the best in the city. You will cooperate." She watched as he glared at her, his jaw working as he wrestled with his own impulse to throw them all out of the window. He finally threw his hands up in a gesture of annoyed surrender, signaling for the tailors to approach. The ensuing hours were a grueling, humiliating process for him. The tailors swarmed around him, measuring, pinning, and fussing over every detail of his suit. He stood there stiff and silent, his frustration a palpable heat radiating from him. Ava stood to the side, her arms crossed, checking off the list as if she were inspecting a piece of machinery. When they finally moved to the etiquette coach, a woman who specialized in softening the edges of aggressive billionaire egos, the tension broke. "Now, Mr. Cross," the coach said, her voice cloying and artificial, "we must work on your handshake. It should be firm but gentle, like a promise, not a test of strength." She reached out, offering her hand. Wyatt looked at the small, manicured hand as if it were a dead insect. He took it, and with a sudden, sharp yet controlled movement, he squeezed. The coach gasped, her face flushing as her knuckles cracked audibly. Wyatt didn't release her until she let out a whimpering sound of distress. Like a promise, he repeated his voice low and dangerous, the kind of promise that breaks if you push it too hard. Ava stepped, in her eyes flashing with anger. "That is enough, Wyatt. You are not in a bar in Montana. You are in New York City, and you will behave like a civilized member of this society, or I will ensure that the capital injection into my father's accounts is frozen immediately." She had touched the only nerve he cared about, the leverage the contract. Wyatt went still. His green eyes burned into hers, a silent, violent struggle raging behind them. He finally let go of the coach's hand, his movements slow and deliberate. "You're good at this, Ava," he whispered, his voice a lethal, smooth caress that made the room feel suddenly unbearably hot. "You really are a perfect, cold-blooded manipulator." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving the coach shaking and Ava standing in the center of the mess, her own heart pounding a chaotic, frightened rhythm she couldn't silence. The blizzard struck with a vicious, howling suddenness, effectively turning the Hudson Valley estate into a frozen, isolated prison. Richard Cross had insisted on this field trip, demanding Wyatt inspect an abandoned luxury development site before signing the finalized acquisition papers. A request that now felt suspiciously like a deliberate exile. Ava stood shivering in the grand, unheated foyer, her designer wool coat offering absolutely zero protection against the biting cold that seeped through the stone walls as the power grid failed with a dying, pathetic hum. The darkness was absolute, heavy and terrifying, stripping away the technological comforts that defined her entire existence. She fumbled blindly for her phone, her fingers numb and clumsy, only to find the screen dead and the cellular signal completely non-existent. "This is a disaster. We are entirely cut off," she murmured, her voice trembling, not just from the plummeting temperature, but from the sudden, terrifying loss of control. Wyatt moved in the shadows with the silent, predatory grace of a man entirely in his element. His silhouette illuminated briefly by a flash of lightning that tore across the violent winter sky. "Panic won't warm you up, Ava," he stated, his voice a calm, gravelly anchor in the storm. "Welcome to the real world." Stripped of his tailored suits and corporate constraints, Wyatt systematically dismantled the luxurious but useless veneer of the mansion. He bypassed the decorative gas fireplaces, heading straight for the estate's rustic original hearth in the cavernous hunting room, moving with an economy of motion that mesmerized her. Within minutes, he had dismantled an antique wooden chair, sacrificing a piece of exorbitant art for the brutal necessity of survival, and coaxed a small, desperate flame into a roaring, life-saving fire. Ava watched him from the doorway, her teeth chattering uncontrollably, as she clutched a thin cashmere throw around her shoulders, feeling utterly useless. He didn't mock her helplessness. Instead, he strode over, his large hands stripping off his heavy fleece-lined jacket and wrapping it firmly around her shivering frame. "Sit by the fire. Keep your hands close to the core," he commanded, his tone shifting from a defiant rebel to a rugged protector. The scent of his cologne, mixed with wood smoke and cold air, enveloped her, offering a strange, intoxicating comfort. For the first time since she had met him, Ava didn't see an arrogant, uneducated bastard. She saw a man who knew exactly how to keep them alive. The roaring fire cast long, dancing shadows across the room, creating an intimate, golden bubble against the howling chaos outside the frost-covered windows. Wyatt sat on the thick Persian rug across from her, feeding the flames with calculated precision, his green eyes reflecting the firelight as he watched her slowly thaw. "So the great Montgomery princess finally finds a problem she can't litigate or buy her way out of," he observed quietly, though the biting sarcasm of his earlier days was notably absent. "Why do you do it, Ava? Why do you let your father auction you off to a man like Richard Cross, just to save a legacy that's already dead?" Ava pulled his large jacket tighter around herself, staring into the mesmerizing flames, feeling the rigid, perfect walls of her upbringing slowly melting away in the intense heat. "Because when you are born into a sinking ship, you are taught that your only purpose is to bail water," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "If I fail, my family loses everything. Our home, our history, our name. I don't have the luxury of freedom, Wyatt. I have duty." Wyatt let out a harsh, bitter sigh, leaning back on his hands as he studied her exposed, vulnerable expression. "Duty is just a fancy word for a cage they built to keep you obedient," he countered, the raw pain of his own past bleeding into his rough voice. "My mother talked about duty to a man who promised her the world and then left her to rot in a trailer park the moment she got pregnant. Richard Cross doesn't care about legacy, Ava. He cares about leverage. You're bleeding yourself dry for people who view you as collateral." The brutal honesty of his words hit her with staggering force, striking a chord of resentment she had buried deep within her soul for decades. She looked at his rugged face, seeing the deep, unhealed scars of a boy who had been thrown away like garbage by the very billionaire she was trying to appease. The sharp, bitter realization that they were both just pawns in Richard's ruthless chess game forged a sudden, unbreakable bond between them. They weren't enemies from different worlds. They were two hostages trapped in the same gilded cage. The temperature in the massive house continued to plummet, forcing them to abandon the vastness of the room and huddle close together on the hearth rug for shared body heat. The dangerous, electrifying proximity that had haunted their penthouse interactions was now a matter of sheer survival. Ava's shoulder pressed against his firm bicep, and every accidental brush of his leg against hers sent a treacherous, heated jolt straight to her core. "You need more blankets if we're going to survive the night," Wyatt murmured, his voice a low, rough rumble vibrating against her side. "There should be heavy quilts in Richard's private study down the hall. Stay by the fire. I'll go." But Ava shook her head, the lawyer in her suddenly hyper-aware of the opportunity this forced isolation presented. "No, I'll go," she insisted, standing up with a newfound determination. "You keep the fire alive. I know exactly where he keeps the emergency supplies." It was a half-lie, driven by a sudden, inexplicable urge to investigate the very man who had engineered this bizarre, rushed marriage contract. Using the dim flashlight app on her nearly dead phone, Ava navigated the freezing, pitch-black corridor toward Richard Cross's heavily fortified private study. The door was unexpectedly unlocked, a rare oversight that spoke to the hasty, frantic nature of Richard's recent departures. While rummaging through the mahogany credenza for blankets, her fingers brushed against a false bottom in the bottom drawer, a classic paranoid hiding spot. Driven by the gnawing suspicion that had plagued her since the boardroom, she pried the wooden panel up, revealing a small, heavy brass key and a leather-bound ledger. She opened the ledger, her legal mind instantly recognizing the devastating pattern of the numbers inside dummy corporations, offshore accounts, and massive gaping black holes in the company's pension funds. The sheer scale of the fraud was breathtaking. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she realized the terrifying truth. Richard wasn't grooming an heir. He was frantically constructing a spectacular, catastrophic fall guy. Wyatt was nothing but a sacrificial lamb being led directly to the slaughter. A cold sweat broke out across the back of her neck, chilling her far more effectively than the blizzard raging outside the frosted glass. Ava quickly shoved the ledger, back-pocketing the heavy brass key, the key that undoubtedly opened the safety deposit box holding the final damning evidence of Richard's betrayal. She grabbed an armful of thick wool blankets and hurried back down the dark hallway, her entire worldview radically, violently altered. When she returned to the firelight, Wyatt looked up, his green eyes softening with a genuine, unguarded relief at the sight of her that made her chest physically ache. She dropped the blankets onto the rug, her hands shaking as she looked at the rugged, untamed man who had no idea he was being marched toward a federal prison. She couldn't tell him, not yet, not without concrete proof. But the fierce, sudden urge to protect him from his own father eclipsed every ounce of her Montgomery loyalty. She sat down beside him, pulling the blankets over them both, realizing with absolute certainty that she had just chosen a side in a war that was about to destroy them all. Beneath the heavy wool blankets, the remaining physical boundaries between them completely dissolved, leaving only the raw, undeniable heat of their shared isolation. The oppressive chill of the mansion was entirely forgotten, replaced by the friction of their bodies. Wyatt shifted his weight, wrapping a strong, protective arm around her shoulders and pulling her flush against his solid chest to maximize their shared warmth. The steady, powerful thumping of his heart beneath her ear was the most comforting sound she had ever heard, a stark contrast to the terrifying secret burning in her coat pocket. "You're shaking porcelain," he whispered, his breath a warm, minty caress against her temple. "I told you, you're not cut out for the wild." Ava tilted her head up, meeting his intense jade gaze in the flickering firelight, entirely stripping away the cold corporate mask she had worn her entire life. "I'm not shaking from the cold, Wyatt," she confessed, her voice a breathless, vulnerable truth. "I'm shaking because everything I thought I knew is a lie, and the only thing that feels real right now is you." The air in the small, firelit space grew impossibly heavy, charged with a magnetic, desperate pull that neither of them could fight any longer. Wyatt's eyes darkened, the last remnants of his cynical restraint shattering as he looked down at her exposed, desperately honest expression. He didn't ask for permission. He simply lowered his head, his hand moving to cup the back of her neck with a fierce, possessive tenderness that sent a violent shiver down her spine. When his lips finally crashed down on hers, it was an explosion of suppressed heat and terrifying, blinding passion. The kiss was rough, hungry, and intensely demanding, tasting of wood smoke and undeniable, reckless surrender. Ava gasped, her hands tangling in his thick, messy hair as she pulled him closer, kissing him back with a fierce, desperate need that obliterated every clause, every rule, and every boundary of their miserable contract. They were two drowning people, suddenly clinging to each other in the suffocating dark, finding a fleeting, beautiful salvation in the ruins of their respective worlds. When they finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, the howling blizzard outside seemed like a distant, irrelevant memory. Wyatt rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as he fought to steady his ragged breathing. His thumb gently stroked her swollen lower lip, an unconscious, incredibly intimate gesture that sealed their unspoken shift in allegiance. They lay there together under the heavy blankets, wrapped in the warmth of the fire and the terrifying beauty of what they had just done. Ava closed her eyes, the hard metal of the brass key pressing against her side through her pocket. The game had fundamentally changed. She was no longer managing a hostile acquisition or saving her family's empty legacy. She had fallen wildly, irrevocably, in love with the frontier air, and she was going to burn Richard Cross's empire to the ground to keep him safe. The morning sun hit the icy windows of the penthouse like a harsh, interrogating spotlight. Ava sat at the mahogany desk in her private office, the heavy brass key from the safe feeling like a live coal in her palm. The ledger was hidden in her scanner, its digital contents already uploaded to a secure, untraceable cloud server, a digital insurance policy that could topple the Cross Empire in seconds. The board meeting was in 3 hours. She knew exactly what Richard Cross intended. He had already leaked a fraudulent, backdated contract to the financial press, a contract that would pin all the company's recent embezzlement directly on Wyatt's head the moment the succession papers were finalized. He was counting on the feral heir to be too volatile and uneducated to notice the legal trap he was walking into. Ava gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. She had spent a lifetime playing by the rules of her class, but those rules had been designed to protect monsters like Richard Cross. For the first time, she understood the wild, unbridled freedom Wyatt possessed. The doors to the boardroom swung open precisely at 9, the air already thick with the scent of expensive coffee and deceit. Richard Cross sat at the head of the long, polished table, his expression one of paternal benevolence, a performance so polished it made Ava's stomach turn. Wyatt sat to his right, wearing a tuxedo that had clearly been forced upon him, his face a mask of stone-cold defiance. He looked like a caged wolf watching the board members, with an intensity that made the room's top-tier legal counsel fidget uncomfortably. Richard cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping the room with manufactured gravity. "Gentlemen, today marks a new era for our firm. It is my distinct honor to officially transfer the operational reins to my son, Wyatt." He gestured toward the stack of legal binders in front of Wyatt, the same ones Ava knew contained the poison pill. "Wyatt, please sign the transfer of liability, and we shall proceed with the formal announcement." Wyatt didn't move. He didn't even look at the binders. His green eyes remained fixed on his father, the silence in the room stretching until it became deafening. "I think," Wyatt drawled, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "that we should have a second opinion on these documents, someone who understands the difference between a legacy and a death sentence." Richard's smile faltered, a flicker of genuine irritation darting across his face as he shifted in his leather chair. "This is a formal board meeting, not a negotiation, Wyatt. Sign the papers." Ava stood up, then, the movement fluid and deliberate, the silence of the room snapping tight like a taut wire. She walked toward the center of the table, her presence commanding the attention of every single person in the room. "The documents as currently drafted contain significant non-disclosed liabilities," she said, her voice clear, steady, and devastatingly precise. "Liabilities that wouldn't just bankrupt this firm, but would lead to criminal prosecution for the signatory." The collective gasp that rippled through the room was a tangible force. Richard Cross went deathly pale, his composure disintegrating as his predatory gaze locked onto Ava with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You are overstepping your bounds, Ava," he hissed, his voice trembling with fury. "This is an internal corporate matter, not for the ears of external consultants." Ava didn't back down. She reached into her folder and pulled out a single thin tablet, placing it on the table right in front of him. "It ceases to be internal the moment it involves federal fraud, Richard. I've already forwarded the contents of your private ledger to the SEC and the major financial news outlets. The servers have the backup and the timer is set." She felt a hand on her elbow, Wyatt's hand, warm, firm, and grounding. He was standing beside her, a wall of support, his eyes now blazing with a triumphant, wild light. He had known she would do it, or at least he had trusted her to find her own way to fight. "You've destroyed us all," Richard roared, his mask of paternal benevolence completely gone, revealing the desperate, cornered animal underneath. He reached for the tablet, his fingers trembling, but Wyatt caught his wrist with a grip that was nothing short of a physical blockade. The boardroom descended into absolute bedlam as the lawyers scrambled to their feet, the reality of the impending legal annihilation sinking in. Ava felt no fear, only a profound, crystalline clarity. She had shattered the glass cage. She had burned the legacy she had been sold as a lifeline. She looked at Wyatt, who was watching his father with a look of utter dismissive victory, and realized he wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. He didn't need the empire. He didn't need the name. He had his freedom, and for the first time, Ava understood that she had finally earned hers too. The fallout was spectacular, a swift, brutal dismantling of the Cross Empire that dominated the front pages for weeks. Richard Cross was led out of his own skyscraper in handcuffs, a tragic, broken figure, stripped of the power he had sacrificed everything to maintain. The board of directors, terrified of the impending SEC investigation, dissolved within 48 hours, leaving the corporate shell to be scavenged by federal regulators. Ava watched the implosion from the sidelines, feeling a surreal, detached sense of peace. She had submitted her resignation the same hour the authorities arrived, walking out of the Montgomery family mansion, with nothing but a suitcase and the terrifying, exhilarated realization that she was finally the architect of her own fate. She had severed the ties to the world that had held her hostage, and for the first time in her life, the future didn't look like a predetermined path, but a vast, terrifyingly beautiful canvas. Wyatt was waiting for her in a beat-up pickup truck, parked at the curb, a jarring, rugged contrast to the gleaming limousines that had always lined this street. He didn't look like a disgraced billionaire heir. He looked like a man who had finally shed a skin he never wanted to wear. When Ava slid into the passenger seat, the smell of leather and dust felt like an invitation rather than an insult. He didn't ask where she wanted to go, and she didn't provide an address. Instead, he pulled out into the relentless gray New York traffic, his hand finding hers on the center console and lacing their fingers together. "No more boardrooms," he murmured, his voice a low, steady promise as he looked at her with a look of raw, unadulterated adoration that made her chest tighten with pure joy. "Just miles of highway, and whatever we decide to build." She looked at their joined hands, the rugged, callous strength of his grip, anchoring her to a reality she had only ever dared to dream of. The journey west was a slow, deliberate shedding of their past lives, a pilgrimage toward the wide open landscapes that Wyatt had always called home. They didn't take private jets or stay in five-star suites. They traveled in the pickup, sleeping in roadside motels, eating in dusty diners, and watching the sharp, aggressive architecture of the East Coast gradually dissolve into the rolling golden plains of the heartland. Ava discovered a version of herself she had long ago forgotten. The woman who loved the smell of rain on hot asphalt. The woman who could find beauty in the quiet isolation of a sunset over the Rockies. Every mile they put between themselves and the now extinct corporate expectations brought a new, profound sense of lightness. She realized that she hadn't just saved Wyatt from his father, she had saved herself from the cold, suffocating, gilded cage of her own existence. When they finally arrived at the Montana ranch, the vast, untamed beauty of the landscape felt like a physical embrace. It was a sprawling, rugged expanse of earth, sky, and endless possibility. A home built not by blood-stained legacies, but by the work of their own hands. The main house was a simple, sturdy structure of wood and stone nestled against the foothills, radiating a warmth that had nothing to do with heating systems and everything to do with the life they were planning. Wyatt parked the truck, and as they stepped out onto the porch, the silence of the wilderness washed over them, a deep, restorative quiet. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with a fierce, protective tenderness that underscored the permanence of their new beginning. "This is it, Ava," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers as the wind whipped through her hair. The only contract we ever need is the one we make with each other every morning we wake up here. In the kitchen of their new home, they stood together as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, casting long golden shadows across the floorboards. There was no boardroom table, no legal binders, no hidden agendas. There was only the simple, messy, beautiful truth of their shared survival. Wyatt reached into his pocket, his hand lingering for a moment before he pulled out the small, worn cocktail napkin from their first night of pretend in New York. He unfolded it, the ink still legible, and placed it on the rough-hewn kitchen table. "Binding for a lifetime," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. He pulled a pen from his pocket and they signed their names, a final, irrevocable act that cemented their new and final agreement. Their story had started with a bitter, hostile collision in a boardroom, a game of pretend with rules written in iron, but it had ended here with a truth written on a napkin, a testament to the beautiful, undeniable fact that the strongest contracts are the ones written in freedom, signed by hearts that have finally, truly been set free.